In the early days of 1941, as the Third Reich tightened its grip on Europe, German intelligence operatives worked in the shadows, their eyes fixed on a distant but growing threat, the industrial might of the United States. The Wehrmacht's victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans had fueled a sense of invincibility, but whispers of America's potential to tip the scales of war were beginning to reach Berlin. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, tasked its agents with uncovering the truth about this sleeping giant across the Atlantic. Their mission was to gauge the scale of American industry, to pierce the veil of a nation that Nazi leaders dismissed as soft, distracted, and unready for war. Among their targets was the Ford Motor Company, a name synonymous with cars and assembly lines, but one that German spies barely considered a military threat. Through covert operations, intercepted reports, and scattered informants, they sought to understand America's capacity, unaware that Ford's industrial prowess, particularly its ability to mass-produce bombers, would soon challenge their assumptions and reshape the war they thought they could control. The German intelligence network operated under a veil of secrecy, its agents scattered across neutral countries, sympathetic circles, and even the United States itself. In smoky cafes in Lisbon or quiet offices in Switzerland, operatives sifted through rumors, newspaper clippings, and stolen documents, piecing together a picture of American industrial strength. They were men trained to see the world in terms of threats and opportunities, their minds shaped by the lightning victories of the Blitzkrieg and the belief that no nation could match Germany's disciplined efficiency. The United States, to them, was a land of decadence, Hollywood films, jazz music, and sprawling cities built on commerce, not conquest. A senior Abwehr officer poring over a report in Berlin scoffed at the idea of America as a serious adversary. "They build cars and refrigerators," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let them try to build a war machine." Ford Motor Company, in particular, seemed an unlikely focus. To the Germans, Ford was a symbol of American consumerism, its assembly lines churning out Model Ts and sedans for a nation obsessed with convenience. The idea that this automotive giant could pivot to producing weapons of war, let alone bombers, was met with skepticism. Early intelligence reports, gathered from open sources like trade journals or overheard conversations in neutral ports, mentioned Ford's factories in Michigan, but the details were vague, dismissed as exaggerations. A spy embedded in a South American trade delegation, tasked with monitoring American exports, wrote in a coded message, "Ford makes trucks, not tanks. Their factories are for profit, not war." His words reflected a broader assumption. America's industry, however vast, lacked the focus and martial spirit to challenge Germany's war machine. Yet, the Germans' espionage efforts were not without ambition. Agents worked tirelessly to gather scraps of information, often at great risk. In the United States, a handful of operatives, posing as businessmen or diplomats, moved through industrial cities like Detroit, their ears tuned to rumors of factory conversions. They intercepted shipping manifests, eavesdropped on dock workers, and cultivated contacts among disaffected workers or neutral diplomats. One agent, operating under the guise of a Swedish trade official, visited Chicago in late 1941, where he heard whispers of Ford's involvement in military contracts. He wrote to his handlers, "They talk of bombers, but how can a car maker build planes?" The idea seemed absurd, a misunderstanding of America's industrial priorities, and his report was filed away, overshadowed by more pressing concerns about British Spitfires or Soviet T-34s. The German spies were not entirely wrong to doubt. America, still reeling from the Great Depression and officially neutral until December 1941, appeared untested in the crucible of total war. Its military was small, its factories geared towards civilian goods, and its people seemingly more concerned with baseball than battle. Nazi propaganda reinforced this view, portraying Americans as soft, divided, and incapable of the unified effort needed to rival Germany's war economy. But the Abwehr's operatives missed critical signs of change. Ford, under the leadership of Henry Ford and his son Edsel, was quietly shifting gears. The company's expertise in mass production, honed over decades of building millions of cars, was being redirected towards military needs. By 1941, Ford had secured contracts to produce aircraft, including the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that would soon darken the skies over Europe. German intelligence, focused on immediate threats, failed to grasp the scale of this transformation. The spies' efforts were hampered by their own biases and the challenges of operating in a distant, unfamiliar country. Infiltrating the United States was no easy task. FBI counterintelligence was vigilant, and American workers, fiercely patriotic after Pearl Harbor, were quick to report suspicious activity. A German agent, caught photographing a Detroit factory, narrowly escaped arrest, his notes on Ford's operations incomplete and vague. Other reports came from secondary sources, merchants in Mexico, diplomats in Argentina, who relayed rumors of massive new factories rising in Michigan. The Willow Run plant, Ford's ambitious project to mass-produce B-24s, was mentioned in one such report, but the details were dismissed as hyperbole. A factory the size of a city, an Abwehr analyst scoffed, tossing the report aside. American boasting, nothing more. The idea that Ford could churn out bombers like it did cars seemed fanciful, a product of Yankee exaggeration. This underestimation was rooted in a failure to understand America's industrial philosophy. Germany's war production relied on craftsmanship and quality, its factories producing tanks and planes with precision, but at a slower pace. Ford, by contrast, had perfected the assembly line, a system that prioritized speed and scale. The Germans, accustomed to their own methods, couldn't fathom a factory capable of producing a bomber every hour, as Willow Run would soon do. Their spies saw fragments of this potential, reports of new machinery, increased steel shipments, or workers flocking to Detroit, but failed to connect the dots. A junior officer in Berlin, reviewing a dossier on American industry, shook his head. They're not soldiers, they're factory workers playing at war. His words echoed the broader German mindset. America might have resources, but it lacked the discipline to wield them effectively. Yet, even in their skepticism, some operatives sensed a shadow of doubt. A veteran Abwehr agent, stationed in Lisbon, read a translated American newspaper article about Ford's plans to build thousands of bombers. He paused, his fingers tracing the words, a flicker of unease in his gut. If they can do this, we may have underestimated them. His warning, buried in the flood of intelligence reports, went largely unheeded. The German High Command, focused on the Eastern Front and the Atlantic, saw America as a distant threat. Its entry into the war a complication, but not a game-changer. The spies, tasked with uncovering the truth, were blind to the scale of what was coming. A tidal wave of industrial might, led by Ford's factories, that would soon overwhelm their carefully laid plans. The stage was set for a revelation that would shake German confidence. The espionage efforts, hampered by distance, bias, and incomplete information, had failed to grasp the magnitude Ford's transformation. The company's ability to mass-produce bombers, once a distant rumor, was about to become a reality that would alter the course of the war. The German spies, laughing off the idea of a car maker building planes, were on the cusp of a discovery that would turn their disbelief into dread. The factories they dismissed as civilian enterprises were gearing up to flood the skies with B-24s, a force that would bring the war to Germany's doorstep with a power they could scarcely imagine.
By mid-1942, the German intelligence operatives, tasked with assessing America's industrial strength, were beginning to sense that their initial dismissal of the United States as a minor threat was dangerously misguided. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had scoffed at the idea that a nation of car makers and consumers could rival the Third Reich's war machine. Ford Motor Company, in their eyes, was a symbol of American frivolity, its factories churning out sedans, not weapons. But as reports trickled in, snatched from neutral diplomats, gleaned from intercepted cables, or whispered by informants in the Americas, the truth began to emerge. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan was not just building bombers, it was producing B-24 Liberators at a speed and scale that defied comprehension. The assembly lines, once mocked as tools for civilian luxury, were now a juggernaut of war production. And the German spies, piecing together this reality, were struck with a mix of shock, disbelief, and dread as they grasped the magnitude of what they faced. The first concrete reports about Willow Run reached German intelligence through a patchwork of sources. In neutral Switzerland, an Abwehr agent sifted through a stack of American trade journals, his eyes catching on an article about a new factory in Michigan, described as a marvel of modern industry. The numbers were staggering, a plant sprawling over 1 million square feet designed to produce a bomber every hour. "This can't be right," the agent muttered, his fingers tracing the figures as if they were a code to be broken. He forwarded the report to Berlin, marked with a skeptical note, exaggeration likely. But other sources began to corroborate the story. A dock worker in Brazil, paid to monitor American shipping, reported crates of aircraft parts labeled with Ford's logo, bound for Europe. A diplomat in Mexico passed along rumors of a factory so vast it had its own airfield. Each fragment alone seemed implausible, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The Willow Run plant was unlike anything the Germans had encountered. In Germany, aircraft production was a meticulous process, with skilled craftsmen assembling planes in factories that prioritized quality over quantity. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that dominated Europe's skies were built with precision, but at a pace that could never match Ford's methods. The American assembly line, perfected by decades of car manufacturing, was a revelation. At Willow Run, workers moved in a choreographed rhythm, each performing a single task: riveting wings, installing engines, wiring cockpits, as partially built B-24s rolled down a mile-long line. A German operative posing as a neutral businessman in Detroit managed to glean details from a loose-lipped factory worker in a bar. "They're building planes like cars," the worker boasted, describing how a bomber could be completed in under an hour. The operative's report, sent in a coded message, was laced with disbelief. If true, their output is beyond our capacity to counter. The scale of Willow Run was staggering even to those who saw only glimpses of its operations. The plant employed tens of thousands of workers, men and women, many with no prior experience, trained to perform repetitive tasks with ruthless efficiency. By 1943, it was producing over 600 B-24s a month, each one a 4-engine behemoth capable of carrying tons of bombs deep into enemy territory. A senior Abwehr analyst in Berlin, reviewing a dossier of intercepted production figures, shook his head as he read the numbers. "One factory doing this?" he said, his voice tinged with incredulity. "It's not possible." Yet the evidence was mounting. Photographs, smuggled from a neutral source, showed rows of gleaming B-24s lined up at Willow Run's airfield, ready to join the growing air fleets of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Germans, accustomed to their own production rates of a few hundred planes a month, were stunned by the sheer volume. The shock was not just in the numbers, but in the implications. The B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber designed for long-range missions, was a direct threat to Germany's heartland. Each plane could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, striking factories, rail yards, and cities, far beyond the reach of earlier Allied aircraft. The Germans had faced British raids, but the American production promised something far worse, a relentless bombing campaign that could overwhelm their defenses. An Abwehr officer, briefing Luftwaffe commanders in early 1943, struggled to convey the magnitude of the threat. "Ford alone could flood the skies," he warned, pointing to a map where red pins marked Allied airfields. "If they sustain this, our cities will burn." His words, once dismissed as alarmist, began to carry weight as more reports confirmed the reality of Willow Run's output. The German spies' disbelief was compounded by their earlier assumptions about American industry. They had underestimated the United States, viewing it as a nation of soft civilians, incapable of the disciplined effort needed for total war. Ford's transformation from car maker to bomber shattered this illusion. The assembly line, a concept the Germans had associated with consumer goods, was now a weapon, its efficiency turning raw materials into instruments of destruction at a pace they couldn't match. A junior intelligence officer, analyzing a report on Willow Run's production, wrote in his notes, "They don't build planes, they manufacture them like toys." His words, meant to be a jab, carried a grudging respect for the system that was outpacing Germany's carefully crafted war machine. The operative's shock was tinged with frustration at their own limitations. Gathering intelligence on Willow Run was no easy task. The United States, now fully mobilized after Pearl Harbor, was a fortress of security. FBI agents patrolled industrial hubs, and workers were vigilant, making covert observation dangerous. A German agent, attempting to photograph the plant from a nearby road, was nearly caught, his camera confiscated by a suspicious guard. Other reports came secondhand, from neutral diplomats or defectors, each adding to the mosaic of Ford's industrial might, but never providing a complete picture. "We see only shadows," an Abwehrhandler complained, sifting through incomplete data. But the shadows are growing larger. The Germans, reliant on fragmented intelligence, struggled to grasp the full scope of what Ford had achieved, but each new report deepened their unease. The discovery of Willow Run's production was a wake-up call, but it came too late to change Germany's course. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin by losses on the Eastern Front and in the Battle of Britain, was ill-equipped to counter the coming storm of American bombers. The German war economy, hampered by resource shortages and Allied bombing, couldn't match Ford's output. A Luftwaffe general, briefed on the intelligence, stared at a grainy photo of B-24s rolling off the assembly line. "This is what we face," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not just their pilots, but their factories." The realization that Ford, a company they had dismissed as irrelevant, could produce bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down was a bitter pill, one that foreshadowed the devastation to come. The German spies, who had once laughed at the idea of a car maker building planes, now faced a truth that shook their confidence. Ford's assembly lines were not just producing bombers, they were redefining the war, turning America's industrial might into a weapon that would dwarf Germany's efforts. The scale of Willow Run, with its endless rows of planes and relentless production, was a glimpse of the future, one where the skies over Europe would darken with American bombers. The operative shock was the first crack in their belief in German supremacy, a crack that would widen as the B-24s began their relentless campaign, bringing the war to Germany's doorstep with a force they could not stop nor ignore.
By the spring of 1943, the German intelligence operatives who had once scoffed at the idea of a car manufacturer like Ford Motor Company posing a military threat were no longer laughing. The fragmented reports that had trickled in during 1942, snippets from neutral diplomats, intercepted cables, and whispered rumors, had coalesced into a chilling truth. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was not just producing B-24 Liberator bombers, it was churning them out at a speed and scale that defied anything the Third Reich could muster. The assembly lines, once dismissed as tools for building civilian cars, were now a juggernaut of war production, rolling out hundreds of heavy bombers each month, each one capable of raining destruction on Germany's cities and factories. The Abwehr agents, piecing together this reality in their Berlin offices or covert outposts, felt a growing sense of dread as they realized the magnitude of America's industrial might. Ford's output dwarfed their expectations, exposing the limits of Germany's war machine and foreshadowing a relentless Allied air campaign that would bring the war to the Reich's doorstep. The scale of Willow Run was almost incomprehensible to the German operatives. Their initial reports, skeptical and incomplete, had underestimated the plant's capacity, dismissing claims of a bomber an hour as American bravado. But by 1943, the evidence was undeniable. Intercepted production figures, smuggled photographs, and accounts from neutral observers painted a picture of a factory unlike any in Germany. Willow Run sprawled over 1 million square feet, its assembly line stretching a mile long, manned by tens of thousands of workers who operated with a precision honed by decades of automotive innovation. A senior Abwehr analyst, poring over a stolen blueprint of the plant, shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't a factory," he muttered to a colleague, his voice tight with unease. "It's a city built to make war." The numbers were staggering. By mid-1943, Willow Run was producing over 600 B-24s a month, more than the entire German aircraft industry could manage for some models in a year. This production rate was a stark contrast to Germany's own industrial capabilities. The Reich's aircraft factories, such as those of Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, relied on skilled labor and meticulous craftsmanship, producing planes like the Bf-109 or FW-190 with precision, but at a pace that prioritized quality over quantity. A single German fighter took weeks to build, each component carefully assembled by workers who prided themselves on their expertise. Ford's approach was different, a relentless mechanized process that turned raw materials into finished bombers in hours. An intelligence officer, reviewing a report on Willow Run's output, compared it to Germany's largest aircraft plant in Augsburg. He wrote, "We build planes one by one. They produce them like sausages." The comparison was crude, but apt, capturing the German realization that their artisanal methods could never match America's industrial efficiency. The B-24 Liberator itself was a revelation, a symbol of the threat Ford's production posed. Unlike the sleek fighters the Germans were used to countering, the B-24 was a heavy bomber, designed for long-range missions deep into enemy territory. Each plane could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, targeting factories, rail yards, and oil refineries with devastating effect. The Germans had faced British raids, but the sheer volume of B-24s promised a new kind of war, one of overwhelming force. A Luftwaffe officer, briefed on intelligence estimates, stared at a map of Europe dotted with Allied airfields. "If Ford keeps this up," he said, his voice low, "our skies will be filled with these monsters." The realization hit hard. A single plant, run by a car company, was producing enough bombers to shift the balance of the air war, a prospect that German planners had scarcely considered when they dismissed America's industrial potential. The operatives' alarm was heightened by the broader context of the war. By 1943, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, against the Soviets in the east, the British in the air, and now the Americans, whose entry into the war after Pearl Harbor had brought new resources to the Allied cause. The German war economy, strained by resource shortages and Allied bombing, was struggling to keep pace. Factories were disrupted by air raids, raw materials like aluminum and steel were scarce, and skilled workers were being drafted into the military. Ford's Willow Run, by contrast, operated in the safety of Michigan, far from the reach of German bombs, its workers fueled by an abundance of resources and a patriotic zeal. An Abwehr agent, stationed in neutral Spain, read a report on American steel production and shook his head. "They have more steel than we can dream of, and Ford turns it into bombers faster than we can build shelters." The realization of Ford's capacity forced a reckoning within German intelligence. The operatives who had once laughed at the idea of a car manufacturer building planes now saw their earlier skepticism as a dangerous miscalculation. Reports flooded Berlin, each more urgent than the last, warning of the growing American air threat. A senior intelligence officer presenting to the Luftwaffe High Command held up a photograph of B-24s lined up at Willow Run's airfield, their fuselages gleaming in the sun. "This is what we face," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Not just their armies, but their factories." The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the truth. Ford's production was not just an anomaly, but a cornerstone of America's war effort, one that could produce planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. The contrast between expectations and reality was stark. The Germans had underestimated America, viewing it as a nation of soft civilians, incapable of the disciplined effort needed for total war. They had assumed their own industrial prowess, honed by years of militarization, would suffice. But Ford's assembly lines, with their relentless efficiency, exposed the limits of that belief. The operatives began to see the United States not just as a distant nuisance, but as a colossus, its factories capable of outproducing the Reich many times over. A junior analyst, compiling data on Allied air strength, wrote in his notes, "We thought we were the masters of war, but America builds war like a machine." His words captured the dawning realization that Ford's bombers were not just a tactical threat, but a strategic one, capable of reshaping the war's outcome. The implications were chilling. The B-24s rolling off Willow Run's assembly lines were joining an Allied air campaign that was growing in intensity. By 1943, American and British bombers were pounding German cities and industrial centers, disrupting production and sapping morale. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by losses on the Eastern Front, struggled to counter the growing fleets of B-24s and B-17s. A German pilot, returning from a mission over the Ruhr Valley, described the sight of American bombers filling the sky. "There were so many," he said, his voice weary. "We shoot one down and 10 more appear." The realization that Ford's production was fueling this onslaught was a bitter pill, one that forced German commanders to confront the reality of a war they could no longer win through production alone. The German operatives, once confident in their ability to outmaneuver their enemies, now faced a truth they could no longer ignore. Ford's Willow Run plant, with its endless assembly lines and staggering output, was a symbol of America's industrial might, a might that dwarfed their expectations and threatened to overwhelm their defenses. The disbelief that had marked their early reports gave way to a grim acceptance. The United States was not just a participant in the war, but a force that could bury Germany under a tide of bombers. As the B-24s began their missions over Europe, the German intelligence officers knew that the factories they had underestimated were changing the course of the war, and there was little they could do to stop it.
By late 1943, the skies over Europe had become a battleground, where the Allies' growing air superiority was reshaping the course of World War II. And at the heart of this transformation was Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant. The German intelligence operatives, who had once dismissed the idea of a car manufacturer producing bombers as absurd, now faced the consequences of their miscalculation. The B-24 Liberators rolling off Ford's assembly lines at an unprecedented rate, hundreds each month, thousands each year, were flooding Allied airfields, enabling a relentless bombing campaign that struck deep into the Third Reich. The sheer volume of these bombers, made possible by Ford's industrial might, gave the Allies a strategic advantage that Germany could neither match nor counter. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, and the German war economy, battered by shortages, were overwhelmed by the scale of the air offensive, a direct result of the production capacity the Germans had underestimated. Ford's bombers, once a rumor dismissed by spies, were now a reality that brought devastation to Germany's doorstep, shifting the war's momentum decisively toward the Allies. The strategic advantage of Ford's production was rooted in its scale and speed. Willow Run, dubbed the Arsenal of Democracy by American propagandists, was producing B-24s at a pace that defied German comprehension. By 1944, the plant was churning out over 600 bombers a month, each one completed in less than an hour thanks to Ford's assembly line efficiency. This output meant the Allies could replace losses quickly, maintaining and even expanding their air fleets, despite the fierce resistance of the Luftwaffe. A U.S. Army Air Forces officer inspecting a new batch of B-24s at an English airfield marveled at the sight. He said, "We lose a dozen planes in a raid, and Ford sends us a dozen more before the week's out." This ability to sustain losses without faltering was a luxury Germany lacked, its own aircraft production hampered by resource shortages and Allied bombing. The B-24 Liberator, Ford's primary contribution, was a workhorse of the Allied air campaign. With its long range of over 2,000 miles and capacity to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs, the B-24 could strike targets deep in Germany, oil refineries in Ploesti, factories in the Ruhr Valley, rail hubs in Berlin, places the Luftwaffe once considered safe. The bombers, flown by American and British crews, operated in massive formations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, darkening the skies over German cities. A Luftwaffe pilot returning from a mission over Hamburg described the sight of B-24s stretching across the horizon. He said, "It's like a swarm. No matter how many we shoot down, more keep coming."
Ford's production ensured that the Allies could mount these large-scale raids day after day, week after week, a relentless pressure that ground down German defenses. The impact on Germany's war effort was catastrophic. The Allied bombing campaign, fueled by Ford's B-24s, targeted the Reich's industrial heart, disrupting production of tanks, planes, and fuel. Oil refineries, critical to Germany's mechanized forces, were reduced to smoldering ruins, starving the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe of the fuel needed to operate. A German factory manager in Essen, surveying the wreckage of his plant after a B-24 raid, shook his head in despair. He said, "We rebuild and they bomb again. Their planes never stop." The constant raids forced Germany to divert resources to air defenses, anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, and repair crews that could have been used on the Eastern Front or in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe, once a feared force, was bled dry, its pilots and planes unable to keep pace with the Allied onslaught. Ford's production also enabled the Allies to sustain strategic flexibility. The B-24s were versatile, used not just for daylight precision bombing, but for night raids, reconnaissance, and even supply drops to resistance groups. This adaptability allowed the Allies to maintain pressure across multiple fronts, from supporting the invasion of Normandy in 1944 to bombing German infrastructure in preparation for the final push into the Reich in 1945. A British RAF officer coordinating joint operations with American forces noted the impact of Ford's output. "The Yanks bombers let us hit wherever we want, whenever we want. Germany can't hide from that." The ability to sustain such a multifaceted air campaign was a direct result of Willow Run's production, which ensured a steady stream of planes to replace those lost or repurposed. The German realization of this advantage came too late to change their strategy. Intelligence reports, now flooding Berlin with urgent warnings, detailed the growing numbers of B-24s in Allied hands. A Luftwaffe general, reviewing a dossier on American production, slammed his fist on the table. He demanded, "One factory does this?" pointing to figures showing Ford's output surpassing Germany's entire aircraft industry. The Germans had underestimated the power of America's assembly line system, which turned raw materials into finished bombers with an efficiency their own factories couldn't match. While German plants struggled with labor shortages, material scarcity, and Allied bombing, Willow Run operated in the safety of Michigan, its workers fueled by abundant resources and a patriotic drive to outproduce the enemy. The psychological toll on Germany was significant. The constant presence of B-24s overhead sapped civilian morale, as cities like Cologne and Dresden faced relentless bombing. German workers, laboring under the threat of air raids, grew weary, their productivity hampered by fear and destruction. A German factory worker hiding in a shelter during a raid described the sound of B-24s overhead. She said, "It's like thunder that never stops. We know there's more coming." The knowledge that Ford's assembly lines could replace every downed bomber added a layer of despair, a sense that resistance was futile against an enemy with limitless resources. The Luftwaffe, tasked with defending the Reich, was stretched to breaking, its pilots and planes outmatched by the sheer volume of Allied aircraft. The strategic advantage extended beyond the air war. The bombing campaign, enabled by Ford's production, weakened Germany's ability to sustain its ground forces. Factories producing tanks and artillery were crippled, supply lines were disrupted, and the Wehrmacht's ability to counter Soviet advances in the East was diminished. The success of D-Day in June 1944, supported by air superiority from B-24s and other bombers, was a direct beneficiary of Ford's output. An American pilot flying a B-24 over Normandy reflected on the mission. He said, "We're clearing the way for the invasion, looking at the bombs dropping below. Ford built this plane, and it's building our victory." The Allies' ability to maintain air dominance, thanks to Willow Run's relentless production, was a key factor in their eventual triumph. The German underestimation of Ford's capacity, once a source of mockery, had become a fatal miscalculation. The B-24s rolling off assembly lines at a pace the Germans couldn't fathom were not just planes, but a symbol of America's industrial supremacy. They enabled the Allies to sustain an air campaign that pounded Germany into submission, disrupting its war machine and paving the way for victory. The operatives who had dismissed Ford as a civilian enterprise now saw the consequences of their error: a sky filled with bombers, a war slipping from their grasp, and a Reich crumbling under the weight of an industrial might they had failed to comprehend. Ford's Willow Run plant, with its endless rows of B-24s, had turned the tide, proving that factories could win wars as surely as armies.
As the smoke cleared over Europe in May 1945, the ruins of the Third Reich bore witness to the devastating power of the Allied air campaigns, driven in large part by the B-24 Liberator bombers that rolled off Ford Motor Company's Willow Run assembly lines. The German intelligence operatives, who had once laughed at the notion of a car manufacturer producing weapons of war, had been proven catastrophically wrong. Ford's ability to mass-produce bombers at an unprecedented rate, hundreds each month, thousands over the course of the war, had overwhelmed the Luftwaffe, crippled Germany's war economy, and secured air superiority for the Allies. The Willow Run plant, a sprawling testament to American industrial might, had not just built planes, it had redefined the nature of warfare itself. The legacy of Ford's mass production extended far beyond the defeat of Nazi Germany, reshaping how nations approached military strategy, industrial mobilization, and the role of factories in modern conflict. The assembly line, once a tool for building cars, became a cornerstone of global power, leaving an indelible mark on the future of war and the world's perception of America's strength. The immediate impact of Ford's production was undeniable. By the war's end, Willow Run had produced over 8,600 B-24 Liberators, nearly half of all B-24s built, each one a four-engine behemoth that carried the Allies' fight to Germany's heartland. These bombers had pounded factories, oil refineries, and rail yards, disrupting the Reich's ability to sustain its war machine. A U.S. Army Air Forces general, reflecting on the air campaign, credited Ford's output with turning the tide. Without those B-24s, he said, we couldn't have hit Germany hard enough or fast enough to break them. The sheer volume of bombers ensured that the Allies could sustain losses, maintain relentless pressure, and support ground operations from D-Day to the final push into Berlin. The German operatives, who had dismissed Ford's potential in 1941, were forced to watch as their cities crumbled under the weight of an air war they had failed to anticipate. This transformation in warfare was rooted in the revolutionary power of mass production. Ford's assembly line system, perfected over decades of building automobiles, had been adapted to produce complex machines like bombers with an efficiency that stunned the world. Unlike Germany's artisanal approach, which prioritized quality and craftsmanship, Ford's method was about scale and speed. Workers at Willow Run, many of them women or untrained recruits, performed repetitive tasks, riveting wings, wiring cockpits, assembling engines, as planes moved down a mile-long line, completed in hours rather than weeks. A former Willow Run worker, years later, described the process with pride. "We didn't just build planes," she said, "we built an army in the sky." This system, born in Detroit's auto factories, allowed the Allies to outproduce their enemies, flooding the skies with bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. This legacy was a fundamental shift in military strategy. Before World War II, wars were often won by the quality of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders. Ford's success at Willow Run showed that industrial capacity could be as decisive as battlefield tactics. The ability to produce weapons at scale, planes, tanks, ships, became a new kind of weapon, one that could overwhelm opponents through sheer volume. Military planners around the world took note. A post-war Soviet general, studying the Allied victory, wrote, America's factories fought as fiercely as its soldiers. The lesson was clear. Modern warfare required not just armies, but industries capable of sustaining long campaigns with a steady flow of materiel. The assembly line, once a symbol of consumer culture, became a blueprint for military mobilization, influencing how nations prepared for future conflict. This shift also transformed industrial mobilization. The success of Willow Run demonstrated that civilian industries could be rapidly repurposed for war, a model that became standard in the post-war era. Ford's ability to pivot from cars to bombers, training thousands of workers and retooling factories in months, set a precedent for flexibility. Governments began to see private industry as a critical partner in defense, fostering partnerships that would define the Cold War. In the United States, companies like Boeing and General Motors followed Ford's lead, adapting their factories for military production in later conflicts. A Pentagon official in the 1950s, reflecting on Korea, cited Willow Run as inspiration. He said, "Ford showed us how to turn a factory into a weapon. That's how we'll win the next war." The concept of the military-industrial complex began to take shape, with Ford's wartime success as a foundational example. The global perception of American power was forever altered. The German intelligence operatives, who had underestimated the United States as a land of soft civilians, had been blindsided by a nation capable of mobilizing its resources with unmatched efficiency. The B-24s that darkened Germany's skies became a symbol of America's industrial supremacy, a reputation that carried into the post-war world. Neutral nations, allies, and former enemies alike saw the United States as a colossus, its factories as potent as its armies. A Swedish diplomat visiting Washington in 1946 remarked on the legacy of Willow Run. He said, "America doesn't just fight wars, it builds them." This image of industrial might bolstered America's standing as a superpower, shaping alliances like NATO and influencing global politics for decades. For the Germans, the legacy was a bitter lesson in hubris. The operatives, who had dismissed Ford's potential in 1941, were forced to confront their error as the war turned against them. The Luftwaffe, overwhelmed by the sheer number of B-24s, could not protect Germany's cities or factories, leading to a collapse in morale and production. A former Abwehr officer, writing after the war, admitted the mistake. He said, "We saw their cars and laughed. We didn't see their bombers until it was too late." The German war economy, battered by Allied raids, could not match the output of American factories, a disparity that proved decisive in the Reich's defeat. The memory of Willow Run lingered in German military circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating an enemy's industrial capacity. The broader impact on warfare was profound. The mass production of weapons, exemplified by Ford's B-24s, introduced a new era where quantity could rival quality, where the ability to sustain losses and maintain pressure was as critical as tactical brilliance. Future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf War, would see nations prioritize industrial output, building arsenals that could outlast their opponents. The assembly line became a strategic asset, its principles applied to everything from fighter jets to missiles. Military academies around the world studied Willow Run, teaching officers that wars were won not just on the battlefield, but in factories, where the tools of victory were forged. Ford's legacy extended beyond the military. The success of Willow Run inspired post-war industries to adopt mass production for civilian goods, driving economic booms in the United States and beyond. The workers who built B-24s, many of them women who had entered the workforce during the war, carried their skills into the post-war economy, shaping a generation of industrial innovation. The plant itself, converted back to civilian use, became a symbol of adaptability, a reminder that factories could serve both peace and war. A historian, writing in the 1960s, summed up its impact. Ford didn't just win a war, it showed the world how to build the future. The legacy of Ford's mass production was a transformation in how wars were fought and won. The B-24s that rolled off Willow Run's assembly lines had not just defeated Germany, but redefined the role of industry in conflict.
The German spies' disbelief, once a source of arrogance, had given way to a painful truth. America's factories were as powerful as its armies, and Ford's bombers were the vanguard of a new kind of warfare. The assembly line, with its relentless efficiency, had changed the world, proving that the machines of war could be built as fast as the machines of peace, and that the nation that mastered this art would hold the key to victory.